Hello everyone, and welcome back to another Live at 5. I am your very Greek curator, Kevin Adkisson, coming to you from the Cranbrook Center for Collections and Research. And many of you saw that yesterday was Greek Day over at the Cranbrook Kingswood Middle School for Girls. And so the center was proud and happy to work with our colleagues over at the middle school to bring to life some of the ancient Greek myths. And as part of that Greek day, the girls built catapults, they had Greek Olympic Games, and they came over to the art museum and we toured some of the Greek sculptures. Now, my role in this was just tour guide, but when they said that the girls were going to be in togas, I said, your guide will be in a toga too. Found out they're not actually called togas, so I'm wearing a traditional Greek male summer dress for you, made out of the bed sheets from my own house. So once you make a costume, you want to get mileage out of it, so why not put it on the day after Greek Day for a little Live at 5. Today, we are going to be looking at some sculptures that we've looked at before at Cranbrook, and then we'll also be highlighting some new pieces that we have not discussed on Live at 5. Now, fair warning for those of you who are sticking with me for the next half hour, you'll know that my roaming Live at 5s that travel great distances do not always keep connected. So if I disappear or if I'm a little glitchy, I apologize. You may want to stop with the very first Greek myth that is represented around and in front of Cranbrook Art Museum, and that is the story of Orpheus and Eurydice. Now, yesterday when I asked the 7th graders who can tell me who Orpheus was, a hand shot up and she gave the most succinct and correct story of Orpheus and Eurydice imaginable. Look forward to this week's Friday blog, which is going to be about Orpheus and Eurydice. The shortest version of the story is that Orpheus's wife, she was bitten by a viper and taken down to the underworld. Now, Orpheus was the greatest musician in ancient Greece. He was immortal, but he played the lyre, and he was so good at music that he could actually cause the animals to dance and even the trees to dance. He played his music and he went down to see Hades into the underworld to find Eurydice, and he performed for Hades. Hades was so enamored, he said, you can take Eurydice back out of the underworld, but you can't look back. And as he was cresting into back onto Earth, he looked behind him and saw Eurydice disappear. So a sad day for Orpheus, but a great day for the muses down in the underworld who got to hear his music. And so here in the Cranbrook group, we are seeing figures from the underworld who are being awakened by the music of Orpheus. Now, we've looked at this fountain a number of times at Live at 5, and I've talked about the fact that there is no Orpheus in our Orpheus fountain. In the original fountain group, or the first commission of the fountain, are about 40 feet high, and so it was decided by Millis, Booth, and Siren that Orpheus would not be installed here at Cranbrook Art Museum in order to not dwarf the scale of the museum to the fountain. So we are left instead with just these figures being awakened by the music of Orpheus without actually representing the god or the figure, the man himself. Now, there is one figure who is not from ancient Greek, and that is Mr. Beethoven, who is seen here in agony that he can't hear the music of Orpheus, as Beethoven has now is represented as going deaf. Now, Carl Millis actually, it's a kind of a dark story, and so he would eventually write on reflecting on this statue that maybe these in fact are not creatures from the underworld. Maybe they are just spirits who are sort of out enjoying the world. So you can see them as creatures from the underworld being awakened by Orpheus's music, but even Millis said perhaps they are just souls represented dancing in the fountain. Now, as I texture, I'm not sure why the broadcast is actually so bad today. I apologize for that. I was just saying that here our Greek temple is stripped of all of its traditional classical ornament and decoration. But what is interesting is the sort of vestige of the Greek key that reappears. So think of Greek architecture and pot design. You have the little Greek key that scrolls around on the borders. And here, Siren has a sort of interpretation of the Greek key, where his asymmetrical design will make various appearances throughout the building, whether that is on the stone carving, the stone plinths. You'll notice the Greek key, a sort of broken line work in the roof of the art museum. And then even down on the paving stones, we again see this interpretation of the Greek key. So I made this point to the girls yesterday, and I'll make it here at Live at 5, but the legacy of Greek culture and art and myths is very much alive and well here at Cranbrook, not just in the representational sculpture, but in the architecture. Now, the next statue is the Europa and the Bull, which is the story of the Phoenician princess from whereabouts modern-day Syria would be, who she was a great beauty, and Zeus fell in love with her, and he transformed himself into a white bull in Europa's father's flock. Europa then becomes enamored with the bull. She makes flower crowns for the bulls. She strokes the bull, and finally she gets onto the bull. And that is when Zeus abducts her and runs across the Mediterranean back to Crete. And so she is the abducted Phoenician princess who will go on to have a life in ancient Greece. And it's quite an old story. It comes from various cultures, Minoan cultures, Greek cultures. It is sort of a reoccurring theme within ancient civilizations to have the rape of Europa or the abduction of Europa. And here we see Carl Millis's version of it from 1926. And what's wonderful about the position here is that in the original position in Halmstad, Sweden, she's sort of just running in the middle of a city square. But here at Cranbrook, she has her flowing tunic, and she is sort of running across the Mediterranean. And so we have this sort of infinity for which she can then march across. It's a weird story to serve as the sort of visual centerpiece of a community, an art school, but it is classically Greek. Now, our next Greek figures are the Tritons, which the Tritons would evolve in ancient Greece from being a specific person, Mr. Triton, who was the son of Poseidon, into a sort of category, much like nymphs and naiads and other creatures. So we are seeing 4 Tritons. Triton is the son of Poseidon, and Triton is the character, the person in Greek mythology who controls the water and earthquakes. And so he's usually shown with spiraling shells, which these 2 Tritons have their wonderful bowl cuts and also the spiraling shell. And so they could blow these shells to create storms or cool weather or calm weather. They can also create earthquakes. And these Tritons date to the early 1920s and were installed here about 1935. And so the Tritons, though I doubt Zeus needed them, the Tritons are sort of escorting the bull and Europa across here, our water. And they're also allowing me the chance to take the sort of smooth passage across the waterway without any storms. I was protected on my little journey here. Now, the next set of Greek sculptures that we'll see are not by Carl Millis. So everything that we just looked at is from Cranbrook's greatest Swedish sculptor, Carl Millis, who was in residence here from 1931 until 1951. The next 2 pieces are ancient Greek pieces that were cast in the 1920s from Roman copies. And when we think of ancient art, we usually think of white marble fragments. But when we see those at the Met or the DIA, you're really seeing copies of Greek bronzes. So Greeks would have valued the bronze original as the sort of highest form of art. And then the Romans were the ones who loved doing marble copies. But it was not quite the way that we would view copying art. It was sort of a way of learning. It was a way of enhancing your physical surroundings. And so there wasn't this idea of sort of the genius of creativity. And so you see in Roman and in Greek art a lot of copying and a lot of sort of copying certain elements from sculptures, and they reappear throughout classical antiquity. Now, these are the Centaurs, which were cast in 1927 for George Booth. They were discovered at Hadrian's Villa around the 1730s, and they became the treasures of the Capitoline Museum in Rome. There were other copies later discovered in ancient Rome that are now at the Louvre. There are copies at the British Museum and the Royal Academy of Art. And then our copies, which are 20th century reproductions in bronze, are from the Curator Foundry. And I've talked about the Curator Foundry a number of times here at Live at 5. They are who did most of our historic reproductions, whether that's the Turtle Fountain over at Cranbrook House or the Greek figures over at the boys, or over at the high school. So the Curator Foundry was really specializing in reproductions, and they made these copies for George Booth. And we see on the one hand the old Centaur, who is looking rather anguished and rather sort of covered in facial hair, and his hands are actually tied behind his back. And in one of the copies, the copy that is at the Louvre, it was uncovered in the archaeological dig with a little angel of Eros, a little putti here, so a little baby angel, and the baby angel is actually tying his hands. And so it's thought that the ones from Hadrian's Villa, which these are reproductions of Hadrian's Villa copy, would have also had those little sitting angels. And so you might look at the old man and then look at the young man, the young Centaur, and think, okay, well, it's youth and age. But in fact, they're probably representing a much more Greek subject matter, which is a theme of the sort of pain of love and the joy of love. And so the young Centaur is representing the joy of love and the sort of freedom of love. And he also would have had a little god of Eros on his back. And then the old Centaur is representing sort of mature love or the anguish of love. And that was a very popular theme. Plato wrote about the joy and anguish of love. It was popular in vase painting and other arts. And so that is probably what our two Centaurs here are representing. Now, Centaurs, which of course I probably know best from Harry Potter, where the Centaurs live in the Forbidden Forest. Centaurs are probably more familiar to us in 2021 than they would have been to the ancient Greeks. They were not a hugely integral part of Greek mythology, and there are even some scholars, and I'm not an expert on Greek mythology, so this is what I've read online in preparing for these tours. Some scholars argue that, in fact, Centaurs could have just been the Greek interpretation of other Eastern civilizations that rode horses. The ancient Greeks did not ride horses. And so is it just Greek seeing someone on horseback and thinking, oh, that's half man, half horse? An interesting theory. Either way, centaurs had sort of two roles in ancient Greece. They were either wild, untamed, liminal creatures who were neither man nor beast, and therefore were always in this sort of state of transition and state of sort of anger and frustration, or they were seen as educators, and you had centaurs who were sort of teachers. Now, our centaurs, again, the copies are from Naples, from the Curator Foundry, but they are reproduced with the signatures of the original makers, who were two artists in Asia Minor. And so the originals in the Capitoline Museum, which are in black marble, they are signed, and so our copies are given that same signature. And you can see that the young centaur has the sort of animal skin draping over him. You don't actually know what this sort of stick figure is. And then you can see that he's on this sort of tree-like base. It was interesting looking at all the different copies. The base tends to change, and even between the Louvre, the ancient Roman copy at the Louvre, and the ancient Roman copy in Rome, they have different bases supporting them. So I'm not sure. I think that goes to this idea that the Romans and the Greeks were constantly copying and adapting their sculptures. And so we see different sort of solutions to the holding of these sculptures. Now, our next Greek figure is one of my favorite sculptures at Cranbrook, and it was also Carl Millis's favorite sculpture. It was the first one that George Booth purchased for Cranbrook. back in 1929. It's a sculpture from the late 19-teens by Carl Milles, and it is our dear Sunglitter, who will make an appearance now along the ledge. And so I think this is the most beautifully situated sculpture at Cranbrook. You come through the archway towards Sunglitter, and you might just, if you're on a walk through Cranbrook, see this sort of mermaid on a dolphin and think, well, that's a beautiful sculpture, but a sort of weird theme, and not quite realize that our Greek centaurs down there are quite related here to our Greek naiad. And so naiads are freshwater nymphs. And again, I was so impressed by the 7th graders at the Cranbrook Kingswood Girls Middle School yesterday, because they told me exactly who nymphs were. Nymphs are freshwater spirits. So they're not gods, they're not mortals, they live for a very long time. They're sort of beautiful protectors, and particularly naiads like this, Sunglitter, freshwater nymph, are seen as the protectors of young girls from their passage from girlhood into womanhood. And so I thought that was a neat thing to read about the sort of mythology of naiads, that they are sort of guardians of the particular age group who was on tour with me yesterday. Now, our naiad is seen in this very sort of dynamic pose where she has this face that I think reveals what must be the thrill of riding a dolphin, which is pretty different from how naiads and nymphs have been represented over the years in art history. They tend to be much more tranquil creatures, even sort of enchanting creatures, very popular among the arts and crafts artists and the pre-Raphaelites to depict nymphs and naiads. But Carl Milles took a sort of different way by making his nymph and naiad this really dynamic, sort of muscular, there's a lot of movement in this sculpture, even down to the way that he creates the dolphin sort of flying on this stream of water. And of course, this little nymph, Sunglitter, has her own sort of Greek tragedy, this is one of the few sculptures that was stolen from Cranbrook back in 2000. We are looking at a reproduction of the original, a new casting. And so it has the sort of Greek tragedy to it. And now our sculptures are much more secure. It would not happen again. But of course, the mystery is still out there as to who took our beautiful naiad. Now, those of you who came to the global house party at Cranbrook know that Onita Voss, the director of Milles Garden in Stockholm, she talked about the naiads and Sunglitter in particular being Carl Milles' favorite sculpture, but also that she sees the Sunglitter as that sort of spark that you see on the water when you're looking at the ocean. Since naiads are technically freshwater creatures, I've now been thinking about Sunglitter as the sort of spot on the Great Lakes. You know, Michigan surrounded by water wonderland that we are. The Sunglitter is sort of that glint of sun coming across the Great Lakes out in the distance. And of course, what are Greek mythologies, what are Greek myths doing for us? They're explaining the world. They're explaining the phenomenons of existence. So why can't the sun on the wave of the Great Lake be a little sea nymph, Sunglitter? Now, there is another Triton here. This is a slightly earlier Triton, again by Carl Milles. And so, again, the son of Poseidon, who is controlling the weather with his spiraling shell. And he's seen here actively control Triton. What's interesting, though, I will step into this basin so we can look closer, is that his hair is also made of shells. And so he's blowing the conch shell, but then he also has hair made up of spiraling shells. And this was a gift from Carl Milles to George Booth, given to him about a week after they met for the very first time here at Cranbrook. Now, next we are going to head back to my favorite object on our little Greek tour today, and that we took the girls to yesterday. I am really hoping that we're going to stay connected to each other. Perhaps that was an ominous connection we had up at the art museum. If I lose you, I will walk back. Spolia are architectural fragments that are moved from one spot to another. Spolia is Latin for spoils, and the Greeks did incorporate spolia into their architecture, but nothing quite like the Romans did. So the Romans really loved using ancient Greek architectural fragments, Etruscan fragments, Minoan fragments, and then incorporating them into new buildings. Thinking of Constantine and the creation of Constantinople, where he moved sort of all of the sacred objects of the Roman Forum to Constantinople and just laid them up and down the grand sort of circus. So spolia is an ancient tradition of moving things. It can either be the spoils of war, and the word does connect the two, but it's much more of a sort of representation of power and appreciation of the past. It's not always a sort of conquest. In the sort of looking back at history, the sort of American obsession with spolia that started in the 19th century and continued up to World War II meant that a lot of people like George Booth, wealthy industrialists, people building museums or building private estates, were engaged in a quite active and quite legal system of purchasing fragments and bringing them to America. Now, I am here at the Academy of Art Administration building. This is the building that served as Cranbrook's first art museum in 1930 and its first library in 1928. It was the first department of architecture. It's now the administration building and department of photography and print media. So the courtyard here was arranged with its spolia when this was the art museum. And George Booth in 1920, what year did he send him out? 1929, I believe, 1926. George Booth sent out a Finnish architect, critic, and collector, Gustav Strangell, with $10,000 in a 6-month time frame to go and buy as many architectural fragments of quality and inspiration as possible. George Booth did not give specifics to Strangell about what he should be buying. He told him to consult with Aeliel Saarinen and then to consult with the sort of professors of Rome as to what he should buy. He thought for $10,000 he should get about 100 or more fragments, and he wanted them to be inspirational. And as George Booth wrote to Mr. Strangell, they should suggest a fine type of architectural expression, and they should be helpful in interpreting photographs and in planning travel. And so here in this courtyard, which is a private space during the academic year, but now that the students are gone, you're welcome to respectfully come back and sort of enjoy this rather special part of campus. And so we are seeing fragments. Almost all of them are Roman. To my records, none are Greek, which makes sense as they were purchased in and around Rome and Florence. But of course, we can't understand Roman architecture without seeing it as a logical development of Greek architecture. And the fragments range everything from sort of 1500 to 200. And so this piece, which is coming up on its 2000th birthday, which is wild, is part of a 2nd century Roman structure. And we're actually looking at it completely the wrong direction. So this is arranged almost if it's a column, but it is actually a lintel. And so it should be tilted up and spanning something like a window. So this would have been the column coming in, and then you would look straight up, and this is essentially the ceiling part of the beam, and those are the moldings. Now, there are other pieces of Italian design, like this little fragment, which is several hundred years old. But the reason I had to bring you back here on our Greek Day tours is to enjoy this enormous Pithos. And a Pithos is an Etruscan storage jar. They were used in both Greece and in the sort of Etruscan parts of ancient Italy before the Romans. This one is, according to our records, from the 3rd century BC, so it's coming up on 2,500 years old. And one thing the girls asked was, is this actually that old? And I said, yes, this is. This is not a reproduction. This is very much an ancient object. And what in the world would you put in a giant vase like this? Well, Pithos they sort of blurred the line between function and art. This one is very unusual because it is so highly decorated. They oftentimes were just very simple large containers, or they would have sort of a Greek-inspired key or some sort of banding on them. You'll notice that the decoration, which I'll discuss in a moment, is all sort of in this area because these Pithos were so large that if you imagine it actually being used as a storage container like this, I mean, it is coming up higher than my chin. And so what they would do is they would actually bury them. And so this very simple base down here would have been underground. It would have kept the container cool. It would have kept it from tipping over. It would have also kept the opening at a more easily accessible spot. Now, you did see Pithos on ships. And used as transportation, but this is not really like a container for a container ship. You would not have actually lifted this one and moved your grain or wine or fermented drink around. You would have been transferring it using smaller vessels like this amphora here, or she is also holding a little jar. So if we were going to move the grains that were stored in here, you would dip in with a different container and move it into the new location or use it here. But you would probably have not moved these. Now, I found a fascinating article online about how much would a Pithos weigh, and based on how tall ours is, if it was filled with grains, it might be 2 tons, the size of an elephant. If it was filled with wine or fermented liquid or oils, it could be up to 4 tons of material. So thank goodness for modern container shipping and modern plastics, because what a way to have to store your goods. Now, the perhaps disturbing feature about this one is that it is so decorated. Again, this project has made me want to reach out to some of my colleagues at other museums that are specialists in ancient cultures. Because what I'm doing is reading about this online on the British Museum site, on the Met site, the Getty, and extrapolating to our objects, because our objects have very thin records. And what I extrapolated about this one in particular was that with all this decoration, it could have been for burial. And so Pithos were also used for burying people. And if it was purely storage, this would either be a very wealthy person who had decorated storage containers, or this is a burial object, a burial vase. And that could either be for one individual, or it could also be for a family. And so it would be the bones of your ancestors in this vessel. Now, if we look closely at what is represented, again, I'm not an expert in Etruscan iconography, but it is cool that we can see things like the shovel here, which for an object that is meant to be half buried underground, the shovel is a great representation to see. And of course, there is a Greek temple here. You can see that they're all wearing their tunics and clasps. Then here you can see the sort of tree with the scholar. I am curious about what he is holding here. I'm not sure what it might be. And then, of course, there is the sort of meta-narrative of the amphora, the vase, and on a vase, which I love an object that's self-referential. Some sort of food on the tray, and then here they're standing around a column. And so, again, my reading of it is, are they somehow either in a temple or in some sort of special place, now that the sort of architectural context of the figures has changed to be centered on this column as opposed to on the bench or with the temple in the background. And then perhaps my favorite of the scenes is this falcon, or this great bird who is eating out of the hand of the figure, and the bird's claw itself is actually holding onto the sort of plate, which I've never seen a bird do that, but maybe I just don't know enough about falcons. And then we're back to the reclining figure who is holding on to some sort of fish or eel next to the tree, or perhaps a textile. I feel like, and if you've been with Live at 5 long enough, you'll know that I did do a Spolia talk on Instagram, and that's when I did a lot of research into Gustav Strengel and the people that he was working with in Rome, the journey that he took. So Gustav Strengel and Eliel Saarinen were long friends. They were friends at the Polytechnic around 1900. Gustav Strengel critically panned Eliel Saarinen's design for the railroad station and caused Eliel Saarinen to redesign it in 1904. Gustav Strengel would visit Cranbrook. He served as Saarinen's English translator when Saarinen first came to Chicago in 1923. So it's interesting to me that Strengel would come back into the story as a buyer for George Booth. Strengel ends up spending much less than 6 months. He becomes friends with Dr. Ludwig Pollock, who is a Jewish-German scholar of antiquities, and Dr. Pollock sort of told Strengel, "You're going to have to buy a lot that's not very good quality in order to get into the inner sanctum of these Roman dealers. You're going to have to buy so many fragments, so many pieces so that they think you're serious, and then they'll open their inner sanctum, and that's where you'll get that top. It may just be 10% of your purchase, but that's going to be the valuable stuff." That is what Strengel did. It didn't take very long, 3 months in and out from October to December of 1926 or 1927, I think 26. He bought all of these pieces, and he was trying to get them out of the country before the tax code changed on January 27th. And he kept writing to George Booth saying, "I have to unpack everything again because the Ministry of Antiquities, the Italian government, would look at every object and levy a 20% tax on whatever you said the value was. And they also had the chance to buy it at that value. So there's this sort of game that you're playing where what is the taxable value? I'll pay less tax if I say it's cheaper, but if it's too cheap, the government will buy it before I can ship it back to America." They finally did get to America between 27 and 29. This amphora was part of that purchase and arrived here in the spring of 1929. It's been back here since it arrived. And so it's a pretty cool collection that we really don't know a lot about. So if you have someone, some scholar of ancient Rome, feel free, ancient Rome or Greece or ancient Etruscan culture, send them over, have them take a walk and see what they see, because I think it's a collection that really could use further research, and which I am slowly but surely getting into. Now, our last piece on our little Greek day tour, after we pass my very favorite gates that Eliel Saarinen designed for campus, these are actually much newer than the building. So for whatever reason, Eliel Saarinen actually rebuilt this wall in the 1940s. And so those gates date to the 1940s, while the building is the 1920s. Our last Greek myth that we'll look at, and then we'll conclude our Live at 5, just as I did my Greek day tours, is our friend the siren with fishes. Now, as I was reading about sirens, they were one of the few Greek myths that I actually remembered from middle school and high school, which, of course, the sirens are the ones who sing along the rocky cliffs and lure sailors to their deaths. What I remembered was that sirens were birds. And in fact, it is something that, because the Greek culture lasts so long, you have sort of transformations over time. And so sirens were originally half woman, half bird. They would evolve into half woman, half fish. And so that is what Carl Milles chose to represent, as is the siren as half woman, half fish. Now, it is sort of interesting to me that she's a siren when, if we called her a nymph, I do not know what is distinguishing Milles's nymph from his siren. They are both sort of double-legged, double-finned, half women, half fish. But it is nice to have another sort of Greek myth referenced here. And I'm happy to report that the girls in the middle school were able to tell me how to successfully get past the siren. You can either ask Circe for some wax to put into your ears. You can be like Odysseus and tie yourself to the ship mast and sail past. Or the god Orpheus, his lyre is so beautiful that Orpheus was able to get his boat past the sirens by playing his lyre, and his music was more beautiful than the siren song. So if only Cranbrook had our Orpheus, I would be able to safely walk down to lunch in the dining hall. Alas, every time I try to get through here, I end up walking into the wall because the siren sings and distracts me. I hope you enjoyed this live at 5 look. It's always wonderful to get special requests from outsiders, but especially from my colleagues and coworkers here at Cranbrook. It's fun to look at objects that I think about every day and that I have my own sort of preferences and interest in. You know, you followed Live at 5 long enough to know I is actually Greek. What is inspired by Greek? How can I tie this into a lesson plan? And how can I, explore objects that I do not always look at, or that I always think of these things from that angle. Usually when I'm talking about the Orpheus Fountain, it's the story of Carl Millis and its creation. It's not really the story of Orpheus and Eurydice. So it was a very fun request. We were happy to do it. Lynette Mayman and I did 4 tours for the girls yesterday, back to back to back. And I think today was the last day of school. So another impressive feat by Cranbrook during the COVID-19 pandemic. We were able to keep our school in class all year, and congratulations to all the teachers and staff at Cranbrook schools on finishing out what surely must be one of the strangest and most difficult school years in Cranbrook's history. I'll leave you today with a look at one Greek story that we never got to on our tour yesterday because I talked too much. We didn't really get to it today on Live at 5, and that is Sleeping Pan, god of the hunt, who is a faun. So he has the legs of a goat and the body of a man, and then he has these cute little goat horns here. And Lynette actually figured out why he was sleeping, but of course I can't remember what she said as to why in classical antiquity Pan is often depicted as asleep. But he is over here, of course, as the god of the hunt and the shepherd. He has a friendly fawn, a little baby deer over here. And so our last little look at Greek inspiration here on Cranbrook's campus. Thanks so much for joining me for another Live at 5. I am Kevin Adkisson, curator with the Cranbrook Center for Collections and Research. I'll be back next week with another topic. If you have a request, send us a message, and I'll be back next week Live at 5 here on the Center's Facebook page. Until next time, thanks so much for joining us for a little Greek day. Thank you so much to the Middle School for Girls for bringing your students over and letting us talk to them about the beautiful objects that were assembled here at Cranbrook for the education of people of all ages. So it's great to be using these art objects as teaching tools. Until next time.